Established over 100 years ago, Watkins Books is one of the world's oldest and leading independent bookshops specializing in esoterica. We have the widest selection of esoteric books in the UK, and our friendly and knowledgeable staff are here to assist you in a unique ambience of our shop. So come and visit us in the heart of London as we're open every day.
The More Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines, available for download on all major digital platforms.
If you like what you watch, then don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates on The More Show. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new weekly television and radio shows.
The More Show is in partnership with Ozark Mountain Publishing, taking readers beyond the unexplained. The comments and views expressed on The More Show are those of the people that make them and do not necessarily reflect the view of Kevin Moore, The More Show, or this radio station and its affiliate or sponsors. This show is for entertainment purposes only.
Broadcasting from the UK and across the world online, you're now listening to the UK's only alternative late-night talk show, and I'm Kevin Moore. For the next hour, I'll be covering subjects that will open up your mind and provide you with information you may have never heard before. On today's show, I'm joined with Mark Ireland. Now, despite being the son of renowned psychic to the stars, Dr. Richard Ireland, Mark Ireland's life took a more conventional path until the unexpected death of his son Brendan, which plunged him into the world of mediums and psychics. Soul Shift, Finding Where the Dead Go by Mark Ireland, is an intimate personal account of a father's unbearable loss and his journey towards a better understanding of death and acceptance of his son's fate. While Ireland loved his father, he chose to pursue a career as an advertising executive, shelving spiritualism in favour of a pragmatic approach to life. On the day of his son's death, Ireland was disturbed by an anonymous premonition regarding his son. With his worst fears later confirmed, Mark re-entered his father's world intent on connecting with the realms of spirit. His latest book, Soul Shift, is an amazing story of psychic communication, which will bring comfort to the bereaved and cause even the most skeptical unbelievers to broaden their views. The author's bold exploration of paranormal phenomena and evidence of life after death and his moving attempts to connect the dead will touch many readers and change their perspective on death forever. Mark Ireland, welcome to the show.
Well, thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
It's great to have you on the show, and I really did enjoy your books, but let's start at the beginning of your story as well. Now, your father was a famous psychic medium. What was it like growing up in a psychic household?
Well, for me, it was a natural, normal thing. I think for other kids that were friends of mine, they were very intrigued by it. But for me, it was just an everyday thing to know that Dad knew everything that was going on and that you weren't going to be able to get away with things. It was part of just our day-to-day activities. He would stop my older brother from doing things that would get him into trouble. And he'd be aware of all these little things on a day-to-day basis happening. But also, I saw him in public venues and his church where he would do demonstrations and give people profound messages that were very specific. Some of those were psychic in nature, and some were mediumship connections where he was giving messages from spirit to people with first, last names, great amount of very specific details. So it was interesting. It was also something that built in a comfort level to me about the knowledge of the afterlife and a confidence in that just from the things I saw from a young age.
Okay, and do you still have any abilities yourself as well?
I would say that I do. I think we all do to some degree. I don't know that I'm at the same level as my father, nor have I really sought to develop it to that extent. But I've had some very interesting things happen that evidence to me that that capability does reside in me as well. One, I think I put in my first book, goes back to an instance that took place when I was, I think, 18 years old. And I had a dream one night about the girl I was dating. And in this dream, I pictured this guy that she had run off with, or was kind of running behind my back with this fellow. And the odd thing was that I knew his first and last name. I think it was Bob Dooley, and what he looked like. And so the next day I mentioned this strange dream to her, and I was going to dismiss it. And she said, no, tell me about it. And then I explained to her what I had seen and the person, how he looked and his name. And she says, I dated a guy named Bob Dooley in Kansas, and he looked just like that. So that's an instance that was, probably one of the more profound ones, just because of the specificity of the information. But I've had other things too, subsequent to that.
Okay, so prior to 2004, you wasn't looking into the spiritual side too much, was you?
I think in the book we kind of over-dramatize that to create some tension. I always had what I felt was a spiritual side and an awareness there. But like a lot of people in this country, I just ended up going to college and focusing on a business career after I graduated from college, and really got into the career thing, and I'd say more materialistically focused, or more focused on worldly achievement. And it was 2004 in January, when my youngest son passed, that kind of broke open this new chapter in my life and took me back to my lineage, the path my father had gone on, and to bring back into the front of my mind the things that I had seen and learned from that time, and to explore a little bit on my own, to get my own view of the spiritual nature of life, and also the forms of evidence of connection to those who have passed on, for my own comfort and for my own curiosity, I guess I would say.
Right, so just for the audience, tell them what happened to your son Brendan in 2004.
Sure. I had been traveling the week prior to this. It was January 9th on a Friday. I got home, and I went straight to Brandon's room, and he was 18 years old at the time. I figured he probably wouldn't be home. He'd be out with friends, but he was laying in his bed watching TV, and I walked in. The two of us didn't say a word to each other. I just gave him a hug. It was like a reunion kind of thing, because I'd been traveling. And the very next morning, he had mentioned this hike he intended to go on. And the hike was in the McDowell Mountains behind our home in Scottsdale, Arizona. And for some reason, I just felt uneasy about it. Now, he hiked a lot, and it wasn't usually a big deal. This one was going to be a more challenging hike, all the way to the top. So I was a little concerned. But a short time later, I was sitting at my computer, and I almost felt like a presence there. And I felt this dire sense of concern relaying to me, not verbally, but just in sense of a feeling, that this hike could be very dangerous and could potentially take Brandon's life. That's just a feeling that came to me. And I tried to talk him out of going, but he says, we're going, Dad. And I didn't tell him necessarily about the feeling I had, but just that it was a bad day because it was windy. So I kind of, in my own mind, the pragmatic part of me just dismissed this and said, okay, it's just your imagination. You're being a worrying parent. But it was late that day, I got a phone call from my older son, who was at work. And he had been reached out to by the boys who were with Brandon on the mountain, indicating Brandon was distressed and was passing out and things, and that they needed help. So my son, who was at work, called me to try and take hold of the situation. So I called the authorities and got them to dispatch a helicopter up there, and we took off driving. We were about 40 minutes away, I think. By the time we got to the base of the mountains, which was just behind our home, there were a horde of spectators, ambulance, fire truck, and the helicopter. And as soon as I identified myself to the authorities, they introduced me to a chaplain. So I was concerned at that point. And usually they don't introduce someone to a chaplain unless they have bad news to share. And it was probably within 15, 20 minutes that he told us that Brandon had passed. So that was the circumstance. And to lose a child is the most painful thing you could imagine. For those who have been through it, they know what I'm talking about. But at that point, you just are numb. And I would say one of the first things I did, though, was I called a number of people who I needed to notify, one of which was my Uncle Robert, who had a gift very similar to my father's. And by this time, my father had already passed, but my uncle was still in the body, physically alive. And he asked if he could do anything for me. And I just said, well, if you get any kind of message or anything you can share, we'd really appreciate it. And it was a couple days later, I was in the mortuary, and he had called me on my cell phone and said, Mark, I wanted to let you know last night I tried to connect and I couldn't get anything. But this morning I got up and was meditating, and your father came to me. And he said he was there to greet Brandon and help him adjust. And Brandon was confused in the beginning, but your dad helped him cope and adjust and cross over. Brandon wanted you to know that you're the best parents he ever could have had, which is what we'd like to hear as parents. But along with that came a validation, which was that he said your dad said Brandon's death was caused by a lack of oxygen in his bloodstream that caused his heart to fail. And at this point, we had no indication as to the cause of death. It was a couple days later after that, I spoke to the physician who conducted the autopsy, and she confirmed to me that Brandon had had a severe asthma attack, which had caused his oxygen level in his blood to go down and his heart to fail. So that was the first confirmation I had from someone along those lines that was helpful and hopeful, and I shared that with family, and then my journey kind of went forward from there.
Absolutely. And do you still find it quite difficult to talk about?
Not really. I mean, there are times when it comes back to you and you can get choked up, but we're pretty well adjusted. I think we've had a lot of support. I think there are things that help people through this and help them be able to move on and understand, that there is a bigger picture to life. We're all going to go someday. It's just, I don't think that we expect the order to be having a child go before a parent. But I think having support from friends and family, having something meaningful to do in your life to help others and serve others, and then also the knowledge, the evidence that life goes on through the various forms, and educating yourself about that's a big help. Between mediumship readings, between ADCs, or after-death communications, or like direct contact, and we've had cases of that, and accounts from near-death experiencers like Anita Morjani and things like that. Just educating yourself about those things, I think, is very helpful, in addition to the support you receive from others and being engaged in something constructive that will help others heal as well.
Yeah. And to have that message come through so accurately must have brought a lot of peace to you.
It did. It did bring peace. And it really wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of the exploration. Because, just 1 month later, I was watching the news in Phoenix, Arizona, and they were showing a clip about a mediumship research project taking place at the University of Arizona. And they showed a medium named Allison Dubois who was there. She was like the test medium. And I was really impressed with what they showed, because she wasn't allowed to see the sitters or have any direct contact with them. She just had to give them a reading, kind of a blind reading. I guess it would be a single blind. And she provided some very specific information that was confirmed by the sitters after the fact. And I thought to myself, wow, I'd love to have a reading with her, and I'd love to be a sitter in that lab someday. Well, the very next day, talk about synchronicity, I received a call from a man named Jerry Concert, who had known my dad and was friends with my dad, and he lived in Dallas, Texas. And Jerry said, Mark, I know what you've been through, and I know someone who might be able to help you. Her name's Allison Dubois, and here's a phone number you can call to get an appointment. Rather ironic. And it was within 1 year that I was actually, in addition to that, I was a sitter in that lab for an experiment that was taped for the Discovery Channel. People can see a clip of that today, as a matter of fact. There's a link on my website.
So tell me about the appointment that you made with an intuitive called Sandy, a week after Brennan's passing, and what stood out most in that reading?
Well, Sandy, yeah, that actually was before I had reached out to some of the big name psychic mediums, and those accounts are in the first book, Soul Shift. But Sandy was someone I talked to almost immediately. And the one thing that stood out to me the most, she talked about that within 6 months there would be an experience where Brandon would make himself known. His presence would be there at the side of the bed. We'd actually see him. And ironically, it was 6 months later that we had just returned back from a cruise. We'd gone on a cruise with our older son, Stephen, and his friend, Stu. And Stu was Brandon's best friend, and he was a boy who would try to resuscitate Brandon for 45 minutes. So the intent of the cruise was to celebrate Brandon's graduation from high school. But since he couldn't be there physically with us, we took Stu in his place. So the day that we got back, we got into our home and we all kind of went our separate ways. And my wife is sitting at the foot of our bed. And while she was there, she sensed a presence to her side. And then she could see a shadow figure to her right out of her peripheral vision. And she just knew that intuitively it was Brandon. She could feel that. And what was really confirming was the very next day we got a call from a musician friend. And this friend had borrowed a bass guitar that had belonged to Brandon, because Brandon was a musician. The friend's name is James Linton, and James was a guitar player, singer, and composer. And he had been recording some songs in his studio. He was working on this one particular song. And anyhow, he called Susie to say, "Hey, Susie, I have to tell you something, but I don't know how to tell you." And she said, "Well, just go ahead, James." And he said, "Well, I was recording this song, and while I was there, I sensed a presence in the room with me, and I saw a shadow figure out of my peripheral vision. And I thought I was just hallucinating, so I went and got some water and got something to eat, took a shower. But each time I came back, it got stronger. I also saw, flashing white lights and things." And he felt guided to reconstruct this song so that it was actually ended up being composed, he felt, by Brandon, and it was a gift for us. And at the end, he told us it's the best song he's ever written, but he didn't write it. So I thought it was very confirming to get his account the next day after Susie had already had her experience with an almost identical situation, and him having no knowledge of this. But that was the most profound thing that Sandy really shared with me. And there were other things talking about how we would be healers and teachers to help other people going forward. I feel that's kind of the path that I've taken. It's really to share this knowledge with other people, to give them comfort who have gone through loss, so that they'll have hope and be able to move forward and have a productive life.
Yeah, and that's exactly what you're doing. And of course, you would give anything to get Brendan back, but do you see the shift that when Brendan passed, that this path, it was open to you, basically?
Yeah, it took a little while to fully understand. In the beginning, I was going down this path out of more of a curiosity and a desire to initially revive my father's legacy, but then it evolved into this healing effort, if you will, to share this knowledge and information with other people. And part of it is, the evidence for the afterlife, but the other part of it that goes along with that is kind of the fact that I feel we have a purpose and a path here in our life, and it's important that we see that and we follow our path so that we grow according to the plan that's set for us individually, and that we not just cast this life away and give up. A lot of parents who lose a kid or people who lose spouses are so despondent that they take the other path and they just kind of hunker down and go into a corner and stop living. And in some cases, sadly enough, people have taken their own lives. I know a few people who have their other spouse, after losing a child, had actually taken their life. But I also know that I've had people come to me who have read my books and thanked me and told me that it gave them hope to carry on, and that some of them had been suicidal and decided not to after reading that and having the hope and kind of seeing and understanding the bigger picture, if you will.
Yeah, and Mark, when we've lost someone and we go through these challenging times, it can be of great help to go see a medium. And would you recommend it? And also, how soon after the passing would you recommend?
I would, in the right circumstances. First off, the person's got to be emotionally ready for that. So there's no perfect time. It depends on the individual. But as a rule of thumb, maybe 3 to 6 months after the passing. But again, if the person's still in a very despondent state, they've got to be at a certain level of composure to be able to do this and to handle it. The other thing is they've got to go to someone who's qualified, who's really gifted, because there are people out there, both charlatans and also people who think they're more gifted than they are. And a person who's bereaved, recently bereaved, who goes to the wrong person and gets a bad reading, it's just going to make it worse. So it's critical that they go to someone that's very credible. So when people come to me, I give them recommendations for people I know and trust. But I've actually gone to the extent here where I've set up a certified medium program, and I'm testing mediums. They have to go through a series of 5 test readings and pass to become certified. And then I'm going to launch a website so people can find the resource. And the reason I did this is for the reasons that I'm describing, that I think it's critical that people go to someone who's credible, and that I get asked so often for this. It's just easier for me to have this put together, and I can just steer people to this website.
Okay, and what is that website?
It hasn't been launched yet, but if they have access to my website, I will have a link on it as soon as it's up and going. I need to get a certain number of mediums certified. I think I've got about 5 certified now, and I'd like to get it up to about at least 10 before I launch.
Yeah, and we're going to talk about mediums just a bit further on in the show, but what were some of the most incredible messages that came through for you?
Well, what makes a good mediumship reading for me is getting specific information that can be validated, especially things that you didn't already know, that you find out after the fact. One such came from a medium named Jamie Clark, who described a photograph of my son with his brother arm in arm, and he said it was on a high pass overlooking water and lush landscape. It looked like Hawaii. And we knew we had been in Hawaii a few years earlier, but we couldn't place the photo, and we'd gone through a drawer full of old photos and found it, which was really cool. Allison Dubois, in my reading with her, had given me information about Brandon, indicating, that his lungs felt like it was a drowning or something. And she had no foreknowledge of the situation, my loss of a child. And ironically, the autopsy physician said that when Brandon's asthma attack was so severe, it caused his lungs to expand and almost touch in the middle, and that only happens in cases of drowning and severe asthma attacks. So Allison's description of that was right on. Lori Campbell, who was the medium who tested with me in the lab in the blinded conditions, she had said that Brandon, she was asked what was the cause of death, and she said, it feels like the air is sucked out of me in my chest area. And she says, I feel like I want to throw up. And Stu, who was Brandon's friend who was attending to him, said that Brandon did throw up just before passing out. And she brought through a number of other things, including the name of my mother and my uncle's wife, my aunt, Linda. So it was ironic. It was my father and uncle's wives' names were coming through. And by that time, my uncle, who shared that early message, he had passed. He had passed just a few months later. So that was interesting. But there were quite a number of messages that were helpful. I'd say the greatest to me of all, the one that was most helpful, and is documented in the second book, Messages from the Afterlife, and it was from a medium named Tina Powers. And she had touched on a number of things that were amazing. The fact that my father had the same gift as she did, that he used blindfolds, which he did for his demonstrations. And then she brought through my son, and she started actually talking in a manner that he would speak. It was almost like a direct channel in a way. It was like dealing directly with my son. And it had to do with a topic of someone I had hired for a specific job, and that it didn't go well. And she said, well, she didn't get it. She didn't get it, Dad. And that intonation was exactly as Brandon would have said it. So I think that was just icing on the cake to not only get the specific information, but to have that sense of his communication style carry that message through.
Absolutely. And when you went to see these mediums, and as you went on your path, that must have helped your family quite a bit, including your wife and everyone else. As you went through your journey, it also helped, I would say, heal them in a sense.
Absolutely. It was a shared thing. So people were always, especially my wife, anxious to hear the results afterwards. And the reading with Tina was interesting because it was not a reading for me. I wasn't even intending to go. There was a friend in Tucson, which was about a 2-hour drive away, who had encouraged me to join her for her reading because she was so impressed with Tina. So I showed up there as a stranger, and Tina was kind of like, "What's this guy doing here?" But 5 minutes into the reading, she was derailed from addressing my friend and turned it to me. And I ended up paying for it because I felt bad because I got all the messages. So that's the other part, that I was very careful in these sessions to make sure that the medium couldn't really know much about me on the front end. So I would have more confidence that way. So I think there's a healthy skepticism that's okay. There are also, debunker type skeptics who are closed-minded from the outset, and they're not really interested. They just want to refute anything paranormal or anything that would lead to the conclusion that we do survive the death of our bodies. But I'm skeptical to the extent that I want to make sure I'm dealing with somebody who's legitimate and that the conditions are set so they don't know much about me on the front end. And the best mediums really want it that way. They feel they can't give you something pure if they know too much. They want it to be blind.
Yeah, and you can imagine what trust that takes a medium to do, especially with such a sensitive sort of subject like this. But in your book on Chapter 5, you do discuss skeptical neurosis. Can science take a place in this field, do you think?
I think it can. There are a number of scientists who are interested in it and who have done research and are still doing research. Gary Schwartz did it at the University of Arizona. People and Julie Beischel, Dr. Julie Beischel runs the Winbridge Institute. She came out of that program at the U of A, and she's doing her own independent research and has been for a number of years now with dramatic results. The University of Virginia Division of Perceptual Studies, which was originally founded by Dr. Ian Stevenson, more focused on reincarnation research, has evolved into areas beyond that where they've researched near-death experiences and also mediumship. And I participated in a research study there with Dr. Emily Kelly. And then in Scotland, Tricia J. Robertson had done some remarkable work in just the past few years. And that's been documented. I think she's tried to get it into a journal, but her book accounts for a lot of that information as well. But she's with the Scottish Society of Psychical Research, which is a branch of the SPR out of London, which was founded in 1882. And you've got, other scientists out there like Dr. Rupert Sheldrake, who's from the UK, who's doing a lot to bring credibility to the whole notion of ideas for how there could be another realm that, I guess, interacts with our realm. A matrix, if you will, underlying this would be my attempt to describe his work or his analogy with some of what he's written about. So there are some. But the shame of it all is that academia still doesn't really allow people to go into this. It's viewed as kind of a fringe area, and there are certain tenets that they have to subscribe to be kind of accepted. So while there may be a lot of scholars and academics who are interested in this, they kind of keep it under wraps because they're fearful for their jobs and their standing within that community.
Sure, and you also have the Edgar Cayce's ARE in Virginia Beach. You must have come across them before, and other institutions.
Yeah, the Edgar Cayce folks who have carried forth Edgar Cayce's work and research around that whole field. But I know some folks who have been very involved in that as well. And then you've got the Bob Monroe Institute too, the Monroe Institute, for folks who want to really learn about out-of-body experiences and how to induce them. So there are a number of organizations and people who are committed to this. But I've come to the conclusion that while I totally respect the scientists who tackle this and think it's important that they do, I think the shift is going to be more at a grassroots level, because I think the average person out there is more interested in their personal experiences and maybe aren't going to read a lot of science papers that are beyond their ability to comprehend. That's where I think the move is going to take place, and where I've shifted more of my effort. While I like the science and talk about the science to support it, I think it comes down to the individuals and their situations. And so if people have an experience that is compelling to them, it will shift their thinking. In fact, it's interesting, but recently Michael Shermer, who's one of these diehard debunker skeptics and has done everything to kind of short circuit this field, he had an experience that he wrote about that was rather interesting, that kind of opened his mind up just a hair. So I'm curious to see where that will evolve. But I think when people have experiences that are direct to them, that's where the change takes place.
Well, that's why I loved your books, Messages from the Afterlife and Soul Shift, because you document a number of really outstanding cases within the books, and it's great for a first-time reader as well. And that's what I liked about it. And you're right, there's been some high-profile neuroscientists as well. People like, in your book you mentioned Eben Alexander, who had the near-death experiences and is now trying to push forward to his fellow colleagues that there is much more to the consciousness and the separation from the brain, and that life continues when you pass on, than what he was aware of prior to that. And he probably was a bit of a skeptic as well.
Right. I know that originally he had been brought up in a more religious household, but he kind of refuted all that later in life. And I've met Eben a couple of times, and we had a nice chat. But I think, if you read his story and his background, I think it's been a big hit because he's a neuroscientist. And it seems like if you have the right PhD or MD or whatever after your name, it makes a big difference. There's a credibility factor there.
Yes.
Even though people have tried to do character assassinations on him since that, it's to be expected, because you're always going to, especially if you're in the limelight and you get a lot of attention, there will be people come after you. But what's interesting about his story is that when he describes the near-death experience, all of these things that took place, one thing in there I thought that was most compelling was he had talked about this angelic type girl that was with him, that he felt so comfortable with her. And when he came back out of the coma to a conscious waking state, he was introduced to his true bloodline family. I guess he had been adopted as a youth and never met his natural parents and siblings. And he finally connected with them, and they had sent him or mailed him a photograph of one of his natural sister who had died. And when he got the photograph, it matched the girl he had seen during the near-death experience. So that was pretty compelling for him, and as a reader, I found that very compelling as well.
Okay, well, we're going to take a quick break here, Mark, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. I'm still joined by my guest, Mark Island. Mark, welcome back to the show.
It's good to be back, thanks.
Now, throughout your journey, in your opinion, what can the afterlife teach us in a sense of improving our life in the present moment?
Well, I guess number one, to be grateful for what you have and to take advantage of the opportunities you have to grow. And it boils down to the basics that are actually in core religions about loving your neighbor as yourself and trying to do the right thing, to treat other people well, to enjoy your life, to be self-sacrificing to some extent. Doesn't mean you can't have fun or enjoy things yourself, but to think about other people and the effects you have in your interrelationships. Almost, a good portion of near-death experiences come back having said they had a life review, and they looked at how they had lived their life, and the things that were important were not the things that they thought were important: the material gain, the notoriety, and all the worldly stuff. What was more important were the relationships with other people, and love and caring for others and doing something positive. So I think those are the lessons. It's really basic, simple stuff. It's just that we get distracted in this world because the priorities that our society has adopted are all materialistic. And it's really a shame, but it's not fulfilling. You wonder why so many folks end up overdosing or die by suicide, who are extremely wealthy, the Hollywood types and things like that. And I would have to suggest that maybe some of it has to do with that focus on the wrong things that don't really bring joy or fulfillment to you, and the things that make your life most fulfilling and worthwhile relate to other people and how you engage with other people, and the good works that you do.
Sure, and you don't have to see a psychic medium. I mean, you did try meditation yourself, and you did manage to bring a connection through with Brendan.
Yes, that is true. And I've actually surprised myself with some test readings I've done for other people with surprising results. But for some reason, I just don't feel inclined to go down that path, at least not right now. But the example you bring up is an important one, because I think other people can do this on their own. And it was just days after Brandon passed, and I was very determined to have a direct connection, not even knowing what that would be like. But I went into a darkened room, sat quietly, and meditated. And during the course of this meditation, I saw Brandon's face inside my mind's eye, and it was like scrolling by like that. And he was smiling, and I felt joy around him, which gave me a sense of peace. And then right after that, I saw a cross with an oval loop at the top pass by as well. Now, I had seen those, but I didn't know what they were or what they stood for. So after I was done with this, I went and Googled cross with an oval loop and found out it's an Ankh, which is the oldest cross of humanity. It's from Egypt, and it symbolizes, the lower portion symbolizes physical life, and the oval loop at the top symbolizes eternal life. So this was very valuable to me, because what it gave me was my son and this feeling of his joy and peacefulness, followed by a symbol that I didn't know. Or in other words, I couldn't have invented this because I didn't know what it meant. I had to research what it meant. And so it confirmed to me, Brandon's life goes on, life is eternal.
Yeah. I mean, the gift to some people who I've interviewed is when someone close to them have passed, it almost allows them to connect with them and bring sort of lost knowledge forward, in a sense.
Yes, to some degree. I think the next, the work that I'll be doing going forward, more of the writing, I do want to focus more on the spiritual teachings part of it too. I've really, aside from anything I could glean through my own intuitive abilities, I inherited volumes of material from my father's deep trance session teachings, going back to about 1960. And there's some very good material there, I think, that could be very helpful to people along the lines of like the silver birch type teachings that are probably the most well-known within the spiritualist community. But I do intend on shifting more of that and having more of that in there. I think the early stages was more focused on evidence to give people the hope. Once you have the hope, then the next step really is about the purpose of life and how to live well and what's important. And so that is going to become more of a focal point for me going forward, yes.
Wonderful, wonderful. With the mediums that you went to see then, I mean, obviously you've seen a number of mediums. Were they all quite accurate in their own kind of validations?
I'd say they were. I mean, they're in varying degrees, where some were more accurate than others. But even, the thing is that I picked good ones in all cases, so I didn't really take a chance on somebody that wasn't qualified, and therefore the results were better on the whole. But I got some outstanding affirmations, as I mentioned before. I'll give you a couple more if you'd like. I know Jamie Clark, when he gave me his reading, I switched and let him finish with my wife. And he had told her that, Brandon's with you all the time. And he's showing me something where you were in the store and I see you digging in your purse and you can't find something. You're like looking for a card that's not there. And it had just been the day prior where she was at the grocery store and she went to pay and she couldn't find her debit card or credit card. And she had loaned it to our older son, Stephen. So that was rather interesting. Tina Powers, when I first met her, and she didn't know who I was, I'd been brought there by someone else. Early on, she said, well, your father and uncle are here, and they're taking me across the country, and I'm going across the ocean, and I'm in Ireland. What am I doing in Ireland? And I said, well, that must be how they're giving you my last name, which is Ireland. So there's just so many of those affirmations that I received in the sessions. It's very helpful to you to have that. And then when you get those specific things, then the other things that come with it help you believe that and accept that information. Because anyone can say, he loves you. Of course, that's a given. But if that comes on the heels of specifics that were beyond chance that someone could share that information with you, then it's that much more meaningful to hear that I love you after that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, unfortunately, the psychic arena, if that's the right word to use, has always suffered from attacks from fraudsters. Yet, you can get bad builders, bad car mechanics, etc. It does, though, seem to suffer more than other areas.
It does. It's got a credibility issue, and it's a shame. And the other part of it is actually, I think there are actually more people who think they're good and they're not than there are frauds. I initially thought maybe there were more frauds, and I've heard cases that were very disgusting to me, especially preying on bereaved people. But I think there are actually more deluded people than there are frauds. But they hurt too, because they're going to do bad work, and then people are going to be emotionally distraught as a result of that. So again, that's why I feel it's important that I do the certification program and steer people to qualified mediums. I can't bow down to this pressure just because people say there's a credibility issue. I just have to forge through it and say, look, there are people that can do this that are good, even if they're in the minority. The key is I want people to have the evidence and the information so that they can understand that this is real, and to not engage with someone for a reading when they're either not ready or they haven't gone to someone who's qualified, because I've seen disastrous results there too. Somebody has a setback with a bad reading early on, and it may set them down the wrong path, and then it's hard to get them back to accept the other view later on.
Absolutely. And reading your book, some mediums hate the word psychic, and others prefer using the word nowadays intuitive.
Yeah, I think intuitive is a little more in vogue now, or another one I've heard is sensitive, but that could have a different connotation as well. So I think intuitive is probably a word that's a little safer, if you will. And I'll use that a lot myself. When people ask me if I have the abilities that my dad did, I'll say, I think I'm somewhat intuitive. That's probably a term I'd use more often just because of the acceptance level of the word.
Yes, and when you look at the history of psychics, I mean, it's always been there throughout ancient texts, hasn't it?
Socrates, he had this, and he was always forewarned of things that could be a problem or an issue for him. And in the New Testament of the Bible, I give an example of Jesus at the well, and the woman comes there, and he basically diagnoses the fact that she had 5 husbands, and the man she's with now isn't her husband, and things like that. So it's been documented throughout time, and in terms of study, I'd say the serious study that began in 1882 with the Society for Psychical Research in London and expanded out to the American SPR with William James. And then, after that, Duke University's parapsychology lab, which ran from about 1932 to 1972. Interestingly, I found an article not too long ago about the lab, and it had to do with a man named Helmut Schmidt, who was the assistant to J.B. Rhine during part of the time that the lab was going. And Schmidt actually said that he was very frustrated in some ways that Rhine wouldn't test professional psychics, because Rhine, I guess, felt that he didn't want to be second guessed, like he'd been duped in some way, and also that he felt like, well, if this is an ability that's real, anybody should be able to do it. Well, in fact, some people are better at it than others. But in the article, Schmidt was talking about, as an example, he had gone to see this man, Dr. Richard Ireland, and my father would put 10 strips of medical tape on his eyes and then 3 black blindfolds and more tape over, and then he'd ask people to write questions and send them up. So he basically did a test on my father, and he went to 3 different tables and asked for a number. The first table gave him the number 3, the next one gave him the number 8, and the third one 5. So he had the numbers 3, 8, 5, and he'd written this with a red pen. He put it in an envelope, and on the outside of the envelope it wrote, "Tell me what's inside." He sent it up, and my father quickly diagnosed it and said, "You want to know what's inside? The number 385 in red ink." So Schmidt said the odds against chance of this were incalculable. But that was just a common thing that I was used to with my father. But it was interesting to hear that from someone who had actually been involved in that Duke parapsychology lab. So I went off there a little bit on a tangent, but so you had the Duke University thing, and then now you have Windbridge Institute, Scottish Society for Psychical Research is doing some work. University of Virginia are the main ones doing the research that I'm aware of in this kind of area.
Right. So, in your opinion, Mark, can a psychic reading have purposeful misinformation in it? You know, can this be given to the reader so that the person having the reading goes down the path of free will?
Perhaps. I know that my father believed in free will, and I do too. But in addition, that there is more like a path to life, a general path that is set for us. So you can vary off, kind of like a river has tributaries, but at the end of the day, all the water ends up in the same place at the end. Because he did make predictions that came true, but it wasn't perfect. It wasn't every time, and I think that's because of free will. Just recently, I met a woman named Rita Davenport who had a television show in Phoenix that she would have my father on a number of times, and he predicted that she would have a child, and that the child would be a son, and when he was born, that she would see fireworks. And she got pregnant shortly thereafter. It was Labor Day that she actually gave birth, and on the TV that was on, there were fireworks as she was delivering the baby. More impressively, a friend of hers was in the studio audience when my father was there one time, and she told the woman that she was already pregnant and she would have twins, and they would be boys. And lo and behold, that did occur. So I think, but people can make choices about things. If a prediction's made and they don't want that outcome, my father felt they could go down another path or do something different to alter that path.
And I think it's important to mention that some people can become psychic junkies, that they must see a psychic before making a decision. Have you come across this?
Seeing a psychic medium first. Have you come across this?
Yes, and I think I discourage people from having readings too often. Maybe once or twice a year is probably sufficient. Really, they need to find their own connection. I think that's why it's important for people to find their own practice, whether that be meditation, prayer, or whatever, or just quiet time to have introspection, because it's their life and it's important for them to make their own decisions and move forward with their own inner guidance. If they always are looking for that externally, that will never be developed and nurtured the way it should be. And I think it could lead to psychological issues as well. So I think, to your point, it's not a good thing for people to overuse that or overdo that.
Absolutely. Now we're getting close to the end here, but I really couldn't. I need to ask you this as well, because your sister passed, I believe, was it in 2006?
Right.
Which must have been another sort of devastating blow in a sense. But due to what you went through and the shifts that you went through, was it an easier passing for you in a sense?
Well, it was. It's hard. I hate to say that, because it was my sister who I loved, but compared to losing your child, it was easier. And I think I had already been through the worst thing you could experience, so I was prepared. And we knew that my sister was going to pass, so we had time with her. It wasn't just like an instantaneous bam, she's gone. So it was easier. It was still difficult. Well, one thing that was kind of interesting, though, on one of the last days she was alive, she was in a hospice and she was kind of writhing in her bed in pain. And my mom was sitting next to her in a wheelchair. I could see my mom was getting very, very sad. And so she started wheeling her wheelchair away from the bed because she couldn't stand it anymore. So I started walking to my mom. And I had this feeling inside that just popped into my head. And it was a feeling that I shared with her. And I said, "Mom, I don't know why I'm sharing this, but I feel like Dad is here and he's not sad because they're going to have a party for Robin when she crosses over." And so that made her feel okay. And I didn't know whether that was a real affirmation. I felt that it was. So a couple days later, one of the mediums that I know, Linda Williamson, who lives in England, she had popped me a note and she said, Mark, I just want you to know that I've got a male presence here. I think it may be your father. And he wants you to know that they're preparing a party for your sister when she crosses over. So it was interesting to get the same thing from another source. I shared that with my mom, and it made her very happy.
How about that? Isn't that incredible? And that brings, I bet that brought a lot of peace. I bet that did.
It did. And also, I guess, confidence that that I should trust what I feel, sometimes more than I do, because I get sometimes too analytical, too much in my head about those sorts of things. And it really comes down to relaxing and accepting. And it's not about me. It's not about, my ego. It's just about trusting information that comes to you and using it for guidance. And in this case, for a sense of peace. But
does it scare you that it might not be correct information? As in, okay, so your ego's out the way in a sense, yeah? Your analytical mind's out the way.
I think that's my hang-up more than anything else, is fear that it's going to be wrong. Either maybe partially for the ego, but more so that I'd say something that could be hurtful to someone. And that's maybe why I've shied away from trying to develop this, because it's a big responsibility.
Yeah, and I wonder how mediums face that challenge and go past that.
It's a tough thing. I think, most of them probably never get completely past it, because they're always going to have a piece of that there. But I'd say with my father, and he was the best example I can think of, he just had such 100% trust in what he got that he knew it was right. He never questioned it. So there was just no doubt there. And if you can get to that point where you've finally developed, and you've put the energy into it. My uncle told me that, there are a lot of people who want that ability or would like to have that, but they're not prepared for the amount of effort that it takes to develop. And through that, the dedicated time for meditation and for practice and things like that, to work with people to develop your abilities to a higher level. And both my father and uncle had that dedication. So in addition to having that innate talent or gift that was within them, it was blown out to a greater extent. Just like if I think about a pro athlete, you could have somebody who's got tremendous potential and then they work harder than anyone else. Well, they're going to be the best athlete, as opposed to someone who has a great amount of talent but won't develop it or work at it. Or someone who has no talent but works very hard, they're going to get so far but not as far as the other.
Well, we're almost at the end of the show, Mark. What would you say is the most important message from the books that you've written?
I would say, if you've suffered a loss and you're grieving and you're despondent because you live in a society that treats youth as the only thing that's important and that this physical life is all there is, that's a fallacy. That's not true. That's not real. You are more than that. You are a soul. You're embodied for a period of time to grow and experience this realm of existence. And it's important. This life is important. It's not a joke. It's not something to be taken lightly. So enjoy your life, share with other people, and live fully.
And where can people find out more information about you, Mark?
My website is markirelandauthor.com. It's Mark with a K, the word author, and Ireland like the country, markirelandauthor.com. Everything's there, and I have a link to my father's site as well if they want to see some videos of him that I think they'll really enjoy.
Well, Mark Ireland, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Kevin. Have a good day.
Well, we've come to an end on tonight's show. Don't forget that you can listen and watch all our past interviews on the More Show's official YouTube channel. Remember to subscribe to our YouTube channel for new daily shows. You may also find out more on all past and upcoming guests on the show via themoreshow.co.uk, and do like us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest updates. So until next time, be safe.